She had nothing left. No husband, no money, no name worth keeping in a town that had already decided who she was. When the boarding house door slammed in her face with her sick child pressed against her side and every eye in Blackbriar watching, Clara Whitfield had two choices: beg or walk away with whatever was left of her pride. She chose to walk. What she didn't expect was the quiet man leaning against the post at the edge of the street, the one who watched the whole thing happen and said only 4 words that would change every life involved. I have honest work. Stay with me until the end of this story, because what happens next will remind you that sometimes the smallest act of decency becomes the loudest thing in a room full of cruelty. Like and comment the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The wagon rolled into Blackbriar on a Tuesday morning, which was, in Clara Whitfield's experience, the worst possible day for anything important to happen. Tuesdays had taken her husband. A Tuesday in March had brought the letter from the bank. And now this Tuesday, gray-skied, wind-bitten, carrying the smell of cattle and coal smoke, was delivering her and her 7-year-old son into a town she had never seen, with $31.40 folded inside her boot and a single trunk strapped to the back of a borrowed wagon she'd have to return by Friday. Elias was asleep against her arm. He'd been sleeping more than usual lately, which the doctor back in Harlan County had said was the fever working itself through his system. Working itself through, as if illness were something polite, something with manners, something that would kindly excuse itself when it was finished. Claire had stopped trusting doctors the same month she stopped trusting banks, which was roughly the same month her husband Thomas had died and left behind a collection of debts she hadn't known existed and a reputation she hadn't earned. She shifted Elias gently so his head rested in her lap instead of against her ribs. He didn't wake. The boy could sleep through anything: thunderstorms, arguments, the creaking collapse of the life they'd had before. Clara sometimes envied him that. Blackbriar wasn't much to look at from the road. A main street wide enough for 2 wagons to pass without touching, flanked on both sides by the usual arrangement of a frontier town: a general store, a livery, a church with peeling white paint, a saloon that had been built before the church and would likely outlast it. There was a barber, a land office, a post office sharing a wall with what appeared to be a dentist's operation. And there, at the far end of the main drag, a 2-story building with a hand-painted sign swinging in the wind. Clara had written to Hargrove 6 weeks ago. She had explained her situation plainly: widowed, 1 child, experienced in cooking for large households, willing to work for room and board plus a modest wage. The response had come back in a neat, compressed hand. Position available. Come before November. M. Hargrove. That letter had been folded and refolded so many times the creases had gone soft. She guided the wagon horse to a stop in front of the boarding house and sat for a moment, looking at the building. It needed paint on the shutters. The front steps had a board that was starting to lift on one side, but the curtains in the windows were clean, and there was a smell coming from somewhere, bread maybe, or something roasting, that made her stomach pull toward it like a compass needle. Elias, she touched his cheek lightly. We're here. He stirred, blinking, and looked at the building with the particular wariness of a child who had learned not to get attached to new places. Is this it? He said. This is it. He considered this. It's big. It is. Are we staying? That's what we're here to find out. She climbed down from the wagon and lifted him after her, setting him on the ground and taking his hand. He was lighter than he should have been for his age, another thing the doctor had said she shouldn't worry about, and another thing she worried about constantly. She straightened her coat, checked that her hair was respectable, and walked up the steps of Hargrove's boarding house with her chin at the angle she had decided years ago was the minimum acceptable level of dignity. The woman who answered her knock was somewhere in her 50s, wide through the shoulders, with the kind of face that had probably been sharp and handsome once and had since set itself into permanent skepticism. She looked at Clara first, then down at Elias, and something shifted behind her eyes. A quick calculation, the kind Clara had gotten good at recognizing. Mrs. Whitfield, the woman said. Yes, ma'am, and this is my son, Elias. We've come about the cook position. Mabel Hargrove looked at Elias again. The boy had developed a cough somewhere around the Kansas border, and he chose this particular moment to demonstrate it, a wet, rattling sound that was worse than it looked, though Clara knew it looked bad enough. Mabel Hargrove took one step back. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just a single, quiet step backward, the way a person moves away from something they've decided they don't want near them. The position, Mabel said slowly, requires someone in full health. I'm in full health, Clara said. It's my son who's been under the weather. The doctor in our last town said, I have guests to think about. Mabel's voice had gone flat. Paying guests with their own health to consider. Elias isn't contagious. The doctor was very clear. I don't know what doctor told you that, Mabel crossed her arms. But I have a responsibility here, and I can't be taking on uncertainties. Clara kept her voice even. This was a skill she had built the way you build a callus, through repeated application of pain. Mrs. Hargrove, I wrote to you 6 weeks ago. You confirmed the position. We've traveled 3 days to get here. Things change. My son is not a thing. Mabel's expression didn't move. I'm sorry for your trouble, Mrs. Whitfield. I truly am. But I also heard some things about your husband, about the debts he left, and I run a respectable establishment. I can't have that kind of cloud following my business. She paused. I'm sure you understand. The cruelty of it was in the word respectable, the way Mabel used it like a shield, like it was self-explanatory, like Clara was standing there not understanding what respectable meant. What Clara understood standing on that porch with her son's hand in hers was that she was not going to cry. She had decided this in the wagon. On this Tuesday, on this particular Tuesday, she was not going to cry where anyone could see it. I understand perfectly, Clara said. She turned and walked back down the steps. That was when she became aware of the audience. She didn't know when they had gathered the way people do in small towns, without seeming to mean to, without appearing to move specifically toward anything interesting. They simply materialized. 3 women on the opposite boardwalk, doing nothing in particular very slowly. 2 men in front of the general store who had stopped pretending to talk to each other. A boy about Elias's age peering around a post, the barber standing in his own doorway with a towel over his arm. All of them watching. Clara walked to the wagon and stood there for a moment with her back to all of it, gripping the side rail. Elias pressed close against her leg. Mama, he said quietly. What do we do now? That was the question, wasn't it? What do we do now? She had $31.40 and a wagon she had to return by Friday. She had a trunk with 2 changes of clothes, a good knife, a cast iron skillet her mother had given her, and a letter that was now worthless. She had a sick child and no references that didn't lead back to Thomas's debts, and a town full of strangers who had already been told who she was before she opened her mouth. What she didn't have was an answer. She was still standing there, working through the arithmetic of limited options, when she heard boots on the boardwalk. Not rushing, measured, deliberate. The sound of someone who had decided to move and was moving without drama. Ma'am? She turned. The man standing at the edge of the boardwalk was not the kind of man who drew immediate attention in a crowd. He wasn't particularly tall, though he was solidly built, the kind of frame that came from actual work rather than the intention of looking strong. His hat was good quality but worn. His coat had been mended at the left shoulder with thread that didn't quite match. He had maybe 10 years on Clara, which would put him in his late 30s, and he had the kind of weathered face that made it hard to tell exactly. Dark eyes, square jaw, a mouth that looked like it didn't get a lot of use. He was looking at her directly. Not at Elias, not at the wagon, not at anything over her shoulder. At her. My name is Gideon Hale, he said. I have a ranch about 4 miles north of town. I've been trying to find a decent cook for about 8 months now, and my current situation is embarrassing. Clara looked at him. Embarrassing how? Something moved across his face. Not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. My hired men staged what I can only describe as a near revolt over the biscuits last week. I'm told the ones I made could be used for construction. Despite everything, the porch, the watching eyes, the arithmetic of her situation, Clara felt something loosen slightly in her chest. Is that a standard job requirement? Biscuits that aren't structural materials? That not burning the coffee more than twice a week? He paused. The position comes with a room, private, off the kitchen. Your boy could have the small room next to it. He glanced at Elias briefly, without the calculation Mabel Hargrove had used. I won't pretend the ranch is comfortable. It's not. The kitchen needs work, and the roof over the back storage has a history. But the work is honest and the pay is regular, and I don't carry other people's debts in my accounting." That last sentence landed carefully. He'd heard. Of course he'd heard. The whole town had heard, or would by sundown. Clara studied him for a moment. She was good at reading people, had needed to be, married to Thomas, who had turned out to be someone quite different from who she'd thought. This man was hard to read, which was itself a kind of information. He wasn't performing kindness. He wasn't looking around to see who was watching him be decent. He had the slightly uncomfortable posture of a person doing something they'd decided was necessary, but weren't particularly enjoying. "You're offering me work," she said, "not charity." "I need a cook," he said. "My men need food that doesn't require an apology." "That's not charity, that's business." "What are the terms?" He told her. The wage was fair, not generous, but fair, which Clara trusted more than generous. Room and board included. 1 full day off per week. She would have authority over the kitchen and the household accounts for food. His 2 full-time hired hands, a man named Colt and a man named Pete, would take their orders from her in matters of the house. "And if it doesn't work out," she asked, "then it doesn't work out and I drive you back to town myself." He met her eyes. "The kitchen door opens both ways, Mrs. Whitfield. You can leave whenever you decide to." Clara looked at the boarding house. Mabel Hargrove was no longer visible in the doorway, but the curtains in the front window had a particular stillness that meant someone was behind them. She looked at the women across the street, who were still performing their elaborate pantomime of not watching. She looked at Elias, who was watching the man named Gideon Hale with the careful sideways attention of a child who had learned to observe adults before trusting them. Then she looked back at Gideon. "When do we leave?" she said. The wagon road north of Blackbriar was better than it had any right to be. Graded, mostly, with the worst of the ruts filled in with gravel. Gideon explained, in the economical way he seemed to speak, that the road got considerably worse in spring when the snowmelt came through. Clara sat beside him on the wagon seat. Elias had arranged himself in the back among her trunk and Gideon's supplies from the general store, and had almost immediately fallen asleep again, curled against a sack of flour with his coat pulled up. "He does that a lot," Gideon observed. "Sleep." "He's been sick," Clara said. "The fever comes and goes. He's better than he was 2 weeks ago." Gideon nodded and said nothing further on the subject. The silence between them wasn't comfortable exactly, but it wasn't hostile either. It had the texture of 2 people who were being careful with each other, which Clara thought was probably the appropriate response to their situation. After a mile or so, she said, "Why did you do that?" He didn't pretend not to know what she meant. "Because Mabel Hargrove was wrong," he said, "and because I actually do need a cook." "You could have found a cook without making a point of it." "I could have," he agreed. "People will talk," she said. It wasn't a warning so much as a fact she was laying on the table, the way you put a card face up to show you're not hiding it. "People already talk," Gideon said. "It's one of the main activities in Blackbriar. The other one is complaining about the weather." He paused. "I've never found that changing my behavior because of either one accomplished much." Clara looked at him sidelong. "You make it sound simple." "It's not simple," he said. "I'm aware it's not simple." Something in his tone shifted slightly. Not defensive, but weighted, like he was carrying a fact he wasn't going to share yet. "But I've watched people do things they knew were wrong because it was easier than the alternative, and I'm tired of it." She didn't ask him to explain that further. He didn't offer to. The ranch came into view as they crested a low hill, a cluster of buildings in a shallow valley backed by a ridge of cottonwoods that had gone yellow with the season. The main house was 2 stories, solidly built from timber that had grayed with age. There was a barn, a bunkhouse, a tool shed, and what appeared to be a chicken coop that had seen better decades. A creek ran along the eastern edge of the property, narrow and quick. "Hale's Cross," Gideon said. It took Clara a moment to realize he was naming the ranch. "Name for the family?" she said. "Name for the crossing on the creek," he said. "My father had a fondness for practical names." The 2 hired hands were visible near the barn, one tall and angular, one shorter and broader, both watching the wagon approach with the open curiosity of men who had been told company was coming and had opinions about it. Gideon pulled the wagon to a stop near the house. The tall one is Colt Yarrow, he said quietly. He's been with me 7 years. He'll be polite. The other one is Pete Sampson. He means well, but he has a habit of saying exactly what he's thinking, which is sometimes inconvenient. As if to demonstrate this quality immediately, Pete Sampson walked over, looked at Clara, looked at Elias, who had woken up and was peering over the side of the wagon, and said, "She's younger than I expected." "Pete," Gideon said, "I'm just saying." "I know what you're saying. Stop saying it." Pete looked at Clara with an expression that was not unfriendly, exactly, but was also clearly not going to pretend. "No offense meant, ma'am. I just figured after 8 months of looking he'd find somebody more—" He appeared to search for a word that wasn't the one he was actually thinking. "Experienced. I've been cooking for households since I was 14, Clara said pleasantly. "I can make biscuits you can't use for construction. I can stretch a pound of bacon across 8 people without anyone noticing. I can make a soup from whatever's left in a root cellar in February. If that sounds like enough experience, I'm happy to start tomorrow." Pete opened his mouth, closed it, and then nodded slowly. "That sounds like enough experience." Colt, who had been watching this exchange from 3 feet back with his arms crossed, allowed himself what might have been a smile. He had a long, sun-creased face and gray starting in his hair, and when he spoke his voice was slower than Pete's, more deliberate. "Welcome to Hales Cross, Mrs. Whitfield. I'll carry your trunk in." "Thank you," she said. The kitchen was everything Gideon had said it was, which was not a compliment. The cast-iron range had a warped door on the firebox that needed shimming. The work table was solid but too low for comfortable standing. Someone had built it for a shorter person, or possibly for sitting at. 2 of the 4 burner grates were cracked. The shelves were organized according to no principle Clara could identify, with coffee tins next to axle grease and cooking flour sharing space with a coil of rope. She stood in the middle of it and took inventory. Behind her, she heard Gideon say, almost apologetically, "I told you it needed work." "It does," she agreed, "but it has good bones." She ran her hand along the edge of the range. "This is a good stove. The door is the problem, not the stove. Is there a smith in town who does iron work?" "Abel Marsh, he's fair." "The table needs raising about 3 inches. Is there someone who can do that?" "Colt's handy with wood." Clara nodded, still looking at the shelves. She was already rearranging things in her mind. Cooking supplies together, dry goods accessible. The cast iron that she'd brought from her own trunk hung on the wall beside the range's existing pots. "I can work with this," she said. She said it to herself more than to him, but she heard him exhale behind her. Something that wasn't quite relief, but was in the same neighborhood. "Good," he said. That first night, Clara cooked supper from what was available. A salt pork roast that needed longer than it got, boiled potatoes, cornbread that came out better than she'd expected given the state of the oven, and a dried apple dessert she made on the back burner while the men ate. She did not consider it good cooking. She considered it an accurate assessment of the kitchen's current capabilities, which would improve. The men ate without complaint. Pete had seconds of the cornbread. Colt carried his own plate to the kitchen when he was done, which was not a thing hired hands usually did, and said, "That's the best meal we've had in this house in about 4 months," in the tone of a man delivering factual information. Elias ate half a bowl of broth that Clara had kept separate for him, soft-boiled an egg, and then put his head down on the table, eyes heavy. "Bed," Clara said. "I'm not tired," Elias said, which was so obviously untrue that Colt looked away with the courtesy of someone pretending not to notice. She carried him up. He was 7, but he let her, which told her how tired he actually was, and settled him in the small room Gideon had mentioned. It had a narrow bed with a wool blanket and a window facing the creek. She sat with him until his breathing evened out, then sat a few minutes longer in the dark because she needed the stillness. She thought about Thomas. She did this less than she once had, and with less of the grief that had felt like drowning in the first months and more of the flat, dry anger that had replaced it. Thomas had been charming and ambitious and had kept his debts the way some men kept mistresses, carefully hidden, tended in private, growing slowly in the dark. She had loved him, which seemed in retrospect like something that had happened to a different person. The woman she was now was not sure she had been paying adequate attention. She pressed the back of her hand against Elias's forehead. Still warm, but not the frightening kind of warm. The getting better kind. She hoped. Back downstairs, she found Gideon at the kitchen table with what appeared to be account ledgers, a cup of coffee at his elbow. He looked up when she came in. "He settled?" he said. "He's out." She poured herself a cup of coffee. Not great coffee, she noted, and added that to her internal list, and sat across from him. There was something she wanted to say, and she was deciding how to say it. "I want to be clear about something," she finally said. He put down his pencil. "I'm here to work," she said. "I'm grateful for the position, but I'm not here to be a problem you're solving or a situation you're managing or a charity case that makes you feel better about yourself. If that's what this is, it's not," he said. "I want to hear you say why." He looked at her for a moment. Not offended, she thought, more like he was weighing how honest to be and landing on the side of more rather than less. "Because I have a niece," he said. "Rose. She's 18 and she's been living in Cheyenne with her mother's sister since her parents died. She's coming to stay here in the spring." He paused. "The men talk about things in this house. Stories travel. I want the kind of house that Rose comes home to be something she doesn't have to apologize for." Clara absorbed this. "That's a complicated reason." "Yes," he said. "Most people would have given me a simpler one." "Most people would have," he agreed, and picked up his pencil again. Clara drank her coffee and looked at the kitchen shelves she was going to reorganize in the morning. "The coffee grounds," she said. "Are you buying them from the general store?" "From Fulton's, yes. He's selling you something that's been sitting too long. I can tell by the smell. There's a mill in Laramie that does a better product. I can write to them if you want." Gideon looked up from his ledger. For the first time since she'd met him, something that was definitely amusement crossed his face. "You've been here 4 hours." "The coffee is bad," she said simply. "It doesn't take long to notice." He almost smiled. "Write to Laramie," he said. The first week was an education in what the ranch actually needed, which was different from what it looked like it needed from the outside. Clara had expected to walk into a household run badly and make it run well. What she found was more complicated. Hales Cross had a kind of rough functionality. The men kept their work separate from the house. The animals were in good condition. The finances, what she could see of them, were managed carefully, if not comfortably. The problem wasn't neglect. It was the specific absence of anyone to notice the things that men working a ranch at full capacity couldn't be expected to notice. That the pantry shelving was pulling away from the wall and needed re-nailing before it fell. That the winter food stores were stocked heavy on salted meat and light on anything that would help a man's constitution through February. That the water from the kitchen pump ran rust-colored for the first 30 seconds of the morning and someone needed to look at the pipe. She noticed these things. She addressed them one at a time, without making announcements, which she had learned was more effective than announcing. On the third morning, Colt came in for breakfast and found the pantry shelf secured and the stores reorganized. He looked at it for a moment. "When did you do that?" "Yesterday evening," she said. "The shelf's been pulling loose for about 2 months," he said. "I know," she said. "The nails were right there on the windowsill." Colt nodded slowly, the way he did when processing information he found unexpectedly complete. Then he said, "There's a broken board in the floor of the back storage. Has been since spring. Gideon's been meaning to get to it." "Does he have a spare plank?" she said. "In the barn." "Can you put it in?" "Yes, ma'am." "Then there's no need for him to mean to," she said. Colt looked at her with an expression that was something beyond respect, or maybe the beginning of it. He put the plank in that afternoon. Pete was a different project. Pete was not hostile. She'd been right about that from the start. But he had a way of asking questions that made them feel like mild provocations, as if he was poking something to see how it would respond. On the fourth morning, while she was making breakfast, he said, "So why'd you really leave your last town?" She was cracking eggs. "My husband died," she said. "Before that." "Why'd you leave before that?" "I didn't," she said. "We lived in Harlan County our whole marriage." "And your husband's debts? Those were real?" "Pete." That was Colt from the other side of the table. "I'm asking what everyone's thinking," Pete said. "No," Claire said, turning around with the pan. "You're asking what you're thinking, and you're allowed to think it. But let me tell you how it actually was." She set the pan on the range and looked at him directly. "My husband ran a feed and supply business for 11 years. For the last 3 of those years, he was borrowing against the business to cover losses he didn't tell me about. When he died, from a riding accident, nothing dramatic, the bank came 2 days later. Not to offer condolences, to inform me that I owed them $640 and the business would be liquidated to cover part of it. She turned back to the eggs. I did not know about the debts. I found out the same time the bank told me. That is what happened. Silence in the kitchen. I'm sorry, Pete said finally. His voice had changed, the poking quality gone, replaced with something that sounded like what it was. That's a rough deal. It is, she agreed. And now you know, so you don't have to ask again. Pete was quiet through breakfast. Then, as he was leaving, he stopped in the doorway and said, Those eggs were real good. It was not much of an apology, but Clara recognized it for what it was. Down. Elias began to improve in the second week. She noticed it in small ways first. He stayed awake through supper instead of falling asleep at the table. He asked for seconds, which he hadn't done in months. He started watching the window with the particular focused attention of a child who wants to be outside but isn't sure if he's allowed. You can go out, Clara told him on Wednesday morning, as long as you stay where I can see you from the kitchen window. He was out the door before she finished the sentence. She watched him through the glass, thin-legged, picking his way across the yard with the slightly cautious movements of a child who had been sick for a while and hadn't quite remembered how not to be careful. He found the water trough and stood looking into it. He found a stick and used it to investigate something near the barn. He looked up at the sky, which was doing something interesting with clouds. He seems better, she turned. Gideon was in the kitchen doorway. He had a habit of appearing in doorways, she'd noticed, as if he was checking whether a room was occupied before committing to entering it. He is, she said. A little more each day. Gideon stepped inside, going to pour himself coffee. He'd adopted the habit of coming to the kitchen in the mid-morning, ostensibly for coffee, but also, she suspected, because the kitchen had become one of the warmer rooms in the house. She had managed that deliberately, keeping the range going at a low heat through the morning, which made the room smell of whatever she had baking and created a kind of gravity that pulled people toward it. He doesn't say much, Gideon said. Not a criticism, an observation. He's watching, Clara said. He watches before he talks. He always has. Gideon poured his coffee. Smart. He is smart, she said, with a mother's reflexive defensiveness followed immediately by a mother's recognition that it wasn't needed here. He just expresses it quietly. Through the window, she watched Elias approach the barn door with the stick he'd found, examine something at the base of it, and then stand back and look up at the roof with an expression of serious assessment. What's he looking at? Gideon said, coming to stand beside her. I'm not sure, she said. Gideon watched a moment, then, There's a barn cat that had kittens somewhere up in the rafters. We've been hearing them, but nobody's found the nest yet. Clara looked at him. Does he know that? No. She looked back at Elias, who was circling the barn door slowly, looking up, the stick held out like some kind of instrument. He'll find them, she said, with a certainty that surprised her when she heard it. Gideon glanced at her sideways. Confident. He's stubborn about things he decides matter, she said. Always has been. Gideon was quiet for a moment, both of them watching the boys' slow investigation of the barn. Then he said, quietly, and without making anything of it, He'll be all right. Clara didn't answer, but she held on to those words the way you hold a hand warmer in a cold room, letting the warmth move into your fingers slowly. It was 11 days in when the first trouble came, and it came in the form of a woman named Dora Phelps. Claire had gone into town with Gideon for the weekly supply run, her first time back since their arrival. She had a list: specific spices, a better grade of flour, lamp oil, thread for mending. Gideon had his own business at the land office and said he'd meet her at the wagon in an hour. She'd gotten through most of her list at Fulton's general store without incident. The man behind the counter, a wiry, nervous-eyed man who was almost certainly Fulton himself, had been professionally neutral, which was the best she expected and more than she'd feared. She'd made her selections, paid with exact money from the household account Gideon had set up for her, and was waiting for her flour to be weighed when the bell above the door rang. The woman who came in was somewhere in her 40s, dressed better than the town probably required, with the particular confidence of someone who had decided a long time ago that their opinion of themselves was the most important one available. She had a friend with her, younger, rounder, more inclined to look at things sideways. Clara recognized the type. She had grown up in a town not unlike Blackbriar, and she knew the architecture of that particular kind of social power, how it ran through the church circles and the wives' groups, and the careful management of who was spoken to and in what tone and in front of whom. The woman came to the counter, saw Clara, and stopped. Not a full stop, a fraction of one, barely visible, except to someone who'd been watching for exactly that. "Mr. Fulton," the woman said, not looking at Clara, "I'll need my usual order." "Of course, Mrs. Phelps," Fulton said with a different quality in his voice than he'd used with Clara. Mrs. Phelps began going through her list in a voice slightly louder than necessary. At a certain point, she said, still without looking, "I heard the Hale Ranch hired on a woman." Fulton said something neutral. "A widow," Mrs. Phelps continued, "with a child, living out there on the ranch." She paused just long enough. "With the men." Clara continued watching Fulton weigh her flour. "I've nothing to say about what Gideon Hale does with his property," Mrs. Phelps said, managing to say a great deal about it. "But there are families in this town, Mr. Fulton, children who see what goes on. People form impressions." "Yes, ma'am," Fulton said. "I simply think," Mrs. Phelps said, and here she half turned, finally allowing her gaze to glide across Clara as if she were part of the shelf display, "that certain situations, however they're arranged, send a message, whether one intends it or not." Clara picked up her package of flour. She turned and looked directly at Mrs. Phelps. Not with anger, which was what the woman was probably expecting and had prepared defenses for, but with a level, clear attention that was harder to deflect. "I'm Clara Whitfield," she said, "in case you wanted to know who I was before deciding what message I'm sending." Mrs. Phelps blinked. Her friend looked at the floor. "I'm the cook at Hale's Cross," Clara continued. "I make biscuits. I manage the household stores, and last Thursday I fixed the pantry shelf that was about to come down on someone's head. That's the situation." She tucked the flour under her arm. "I hope your order comes out right." She walked out. On the boardwalk, with the door closed behind her and Blackbriar's main street laid out in front of her, she stopped and breathed through her nose for a moment. Her hands were not shaking. She checked because they had shaken on Mabel Hargrove's porch, and she had been angry about that for 11 days. Not shaking. Good. She walked to the wagon and waited. Gideon came from the direction of the land office about 20 minutes later. He had the slightly tight-faced expression of someone whose business at the land office had not gone especially well, but he stored it away when he saw her. "Everything all right?" he said. "I met Mrs. Phelps," Clara said. Something moved through his expression, not surprise. "Ah," he said. "She seems like a woman who spent a lot of time considering other people's situations." "She has," Gideon said. He set his saddlebag in the wagon and began checking the harness. "She also runs the women's committee at the church, and her husband has a seat on the town board." He said this without drama, just the way he laid out facts, which means she has opinions that travel. "I noticed." He looked at her. "What did you say to her?" Clara told him. Gideon was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That was well handled." "I don't know if it'll help," she said. "It won't," he agreed. "But it was still well handled." He climbed up to the seat and offered her a hand up, which she took without making anything of it either way. "It'll get louder before it gets quieter. I want you to know that's likely." "I've been through loud before," Clara said. He nodded, slapped the reins. The horse started forward. They rode the 4 miles back to the ranch in the kind of silence that had started to feel, without either of them planning it, almost like something they shared rather than something that divided them. That evening, after supper, Elias came to her with something cupped in his hands. She was washing dishes. He stood beside her, hands closed, waiting. "What have you got?" she said. He opened his hands. In his palm sat a tiny gray kitten, eyes just barely open, not much bigger than the cup of his hand. "I found the nest," he said. There was something in his voice she hadn't heard in months. A brightness, uncomplicated, the voice of a child who has forgotten, just for this moment, to be careful. "Elias," she said, "you have to put it back. The mother won't—" "I already put the others back," he said. I just wanted to show you this one. I'll put her back too." He looked down at the kitten. "There are 4. 2 gray, 1 orange, 1 with spots." He looked up at her. "Can I name them?" Clara looked at her son, thin, still paler than he should be, holding something small and new in his hands with the absolute concentration of a child who has found something that matters. "Yes," she said. "You can name them." He turned and went carefully back toward the barn, cradling the kitten with a 7-year-old's very serious impression of gentleness. At the barn door he stopped and looked back. "Mama." "What?" "This is a good place," he said simply. Then he went inside. Clara stood at the kitchen window for a long time after that, her hands still wet from the dishes. The ranch was going dark around its edges, the last light sitting on the ridge of cottonwoods, the smell of the range still warm in the kitchen behind her. She thought about the boarding house door. She thought about Mabel Hargrove's single step backward. She thought about Mrs. Phelps's sideways glance and Thomas's hidden debts, and the long, particular loneliness of being a woman in a situation you didn't choose with a child depending on you to make it come out right. She thought about a kitchen door that Gideon Hale had said opened both ways. She turned back to the dishes. There was work to do. There was always work to do. But for the first time in a long time, the work felt like it was building something rather than just holding something off. Outside, a coyote called from somewhere past the cottonwoods, long and thin in the cooling air. The creek made its own sound, low and constant. Elias was naming kittens in a barn in Wyoming territory. And Clara Whitfield, who had arrived in Blackbriar with $31.40 in her boot and nowhere to go, was washing dishes in a kitchen that was slowly, imperfectly, stubbornly beginning to feel like hers. 3 weeks into her time at Hales Cross, Clara had developed what she privately thought of as a working understanding of the ranch's rhythms. Not a comfortable understanding, not yet, but a functional one, the kind you build through repetition rather than ease. Mornings started before the men were up. She had the range going by 5, coffee ready by 5:15, breakfast on the table by 6. Colt came in first, always, hat already on, nodding to her the way you nod to someone you've decided to respect without making a production of it. Pete came in second, usually still buttoning something, usually with an opinion already forming about whatever the day looked like outside. Gideon came last, after he'd done whatever he did in the barn first thing. She'd never asked, and he'd never explained, but she'd noticed the pattern. Elias ate with them now. That had happened naturally, without anyone deciding it. One morning he had come downstairs while the men were still at the table, and Pete had shifted over on the bench to make room, and that was that. He sat between Pete and the wall, eating with the careful focus of a child who was still reminding his body that eating was good and worth doing, and he listened to the men's conversation with the quiet intensity that was his particular gift. The kittens had been named. The gray ones were Smoke and Stone. The orange one was Coal, which Elias had chosen on the grounds that it was almost the same color as the range when it got going. The spotted one, the smallest, the one Elias had carried to the kitchen to show Clara that first evening, was named Penny, for reasons Elias had not fully explained but which seemed to satisfy him. The mother cat, a lean tabby with a torn ear and strong opinions, had observed Elias's naming ceremony from a rafter with professional skepticism and then, over the following week, had begun appearing at the kitchen door. Clara fed her scraps. She told herself it was practical. A working barn cat was useful, and a fed cat was a better mouser than a starving one. And this was true, and also not entirely the point. The ranch was settling into something. She could feel it, the way you can feel a room change temperature. Not dramatic, just the slow accumulation of small differences. The work table had been raised by Colt, who had done it on a Saturday afternoon without being asked again, adding 2 inches of solid oak to each leg and sanding the joints until they were flush. The pantry was organized in a way that made sense. The rust in the morning water had stopped on the 11th day when Pete, motivated apparently by his own irritation with it rather than any directive from Clara, had gone out and replaced the pipe joint. The coffee, since she'd switched suppliers, was considerably better. These were small things. Clara knew they were small things. But she had learned in the years of her marriage and the harsher year after it that small things were what lives were actually made of, and that people who waited for large things to change their circumstances usually waited a long time. What she had not counted on, or had perhaps counted on and simply hoped would not arrive as quickly as it did, was the weight of what was happening outside the ranch's fences. It started the second time she went to town. She'd gone alone this time, which was her own decision. Gideon had offered to come, and she'd said no because she was not going to spend the rest of her time at Hale's Cross requiring an escort to purchase flour. She took the wagon, she made her list, she went to Fulton's. Fulton himself was professional, if cooler than strict necessity required. The transaction was fine. It was on the boardwalk coming out that she passed two women she didn't know, and they stopped talking when she went by. Not the natural pause of people recognizing a stranger. The other kind. The deliberate, pointed silence that is its own kind of statement. She walked to the wagon and drove home. The following week, she heard from Colt, who had his own separate lines of information into town, developed over 7 years of living nearby, that Mrs. Phelps had made the situation a topic at the women's committee meeting at the church hall. The exact language Colt reported, with the uncomfortable look of a man delivering information he hadn't enjoyed receiving, was that Mrs. Phelps had said it was a shame what some women will do when they have nothing left to lose. Clara was rolling dough when Colt told her this. She kept rolling. She say anything specific? Clara said. Nothing she couldn't claim was general concern, Colt said. He was at the table with his coffee, turning the cup in his hands. Which is how Dora Phelps operates. She's careful. Careful people cause more damage than careless ones, Claire said. Careless people can be argued with. Colt nodded. He looked like he wanted to say something else, and then apparently decided against it and drank his coffee. What he hadn't said arrived anyway, that evening, through Pete, who had considerably less control over what came out of his mouth and significantly less guilt about it. He came in for supper and said, while Clara was carrying dishes to the table, "You hear what they're calling this place in town?" "Pete," Colt said. "She's going to hear it anyway," Pete said, with the particular logic of a man who confuses informing someone of bad news with causing it. He looked at Clara. "Some folks are calling it Hale's arrangement, like it's some kind of—" He stopped. "You know." Clara set the dish down. "I know what they mean," she said. "It's not right," Pete said, and sounded genuinely angry about it, which surprised her slightly. "It's not right, and it's not true, and the people saying it know that, which makes it worse." "Yes," she said. "It does." The table was quiet through most of supper. Elias, who absorbed the room's temperature the way he absorbed everything, silently, completely, ate his food without asking what was wrong, which many understood something was. After supper, he helped Clara carry plates without being asked, which he did sometimes now, moving quietly around the kitchen with the careful efficiency of a child trying to be useful in a situation he couldn't name. Later, when he was in bed and the men had gone to the bunkhouse, Clara sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold in front of her, working through the situation the way she worked through problems with the pantry, inventorying what was there, what was missing, what could be done about either. The door opened and Gideon came in. He went to the range, poured himself coffee, and then, instead of going to his study as he usually did in the evenings, he sat down across from her. He had a ledger under his arm, which he put on the table but didn't open. They sat there for a moment, the kitchen quiet around them, the range ticking. "Colt told you," she said. It wasn't a question. "Pete told me," he said. "Colt told Pete not to, and Pete told me anyway, and then told me that Colt had told him not to, in case I wanted to know that Colt had tried." He paused. "Pete is a complete disaster at discretion." "He means well," Clara said. "He does," Gideon agreed. He turned his coffee cup. "I owe you an honest conversation." "You do," she said. He looked at her directly, the way he did when he was going to say something he'd decided not to soften. "It's going to get worse before it resolves itself, if it resolves itself. Dora Phelps has her husband's ear, and her husband has the board's ear, and the board has—" He paused. "There are things that depend on my standing with the town. Water rights being negotiated. A land question that's been in process for 2 years. If my name becomes something they can use against those proceedings, it causes real problems." Clara was quiet for a moment. "You're telling me this affects more than your reputation?" "Yes." "Then you should have thought about that before you offered the position." "I did think about it," he said. "I thought about it, and I offered anyway. And I'm not rescinding. I'm informing. There's a difference." He kept his eyes on hers. But I also think you should know what you're in the middle of, because it's not fair for you to be in the middle of something without the full picture. Clara thought about Elias upstairs, asleep, breathing without the rattling cough, having named 4 kittens, having said this is a good place with the certainty of a child who doesn't say things he doesn't mean. What would you do, she said carefully, if I told you I was thinking about leaving? Something shifted in his expression, fast, almost too fast to see. I'd take you and Elias back to town myself, he said, as I told you when you arrived. And the door opening both ways. Yes. She looked at him for a long moment. I'm not telling you I'm leaving, she said. I'm asking what you'd do if I were. He seemed to understand the distinction. Then I'd ask you to reconsider, he said. Not because of the cook position, because this is the first time in 8 months this kitchen has smelled like something worth coming into, and because Elias found those kittens, and because… He stopped. Because I think you leaving would be a worse outcome than whatever Dora Phelps decides to do with her committee. Clara looked at her tea, which was fully cold now. That's a more honest answer than I expected, she said. I'm better at honest than at comfortable, he said. Ask anyone. Despite the weight of the conversation, something near a smile moved across her face. I've noticed that. They sat with it a while. The situation, the complications, the things that were true, and the things that were unfair, and the particular difficulty of those 2 categories overlapping. Outside, the wind had picked up and was doing something against the north side of the house that sounded like argument. There's another thing, Gideon said finally. She looked up. My niece Rose. He turned his coffee cup again. She'd noticed he did this when he was choosing words carefully. She wrote. She's coming in March, not April. Her aunt's situation changed and she needed to move the timing. That's earlier than you'd planned. 6 weeks earlier. He set the cup down. She's 18, and she grew up in Cheyenne, and she has opinions about most things that she does not keep to herself. And she… He paused. She was very close to her mother, who was my brother's wife, who was a very particular kind of woman. What kind? Clara said. The kind, Gideon said. Who would have had an opinion about this situation? A Dora Phelps kind of opinion, or a different kind? He considered this genuinely. A harder kind to argue with, he said finally, because it would come from somewhere real. Clara absorbed this. A girl of 18, grieving her parents, coming to a ranch where the new household arrangement was already being called Hale's arrangement in town. That was a situation with specific complications. Let me manage that when it arrives, Clara said. He looked at her. You don't know what you're agreeing to. I know I'm better at managing difficult situations face-to-face than I am at dreading them in advance, she said. So let me meet Rose when she gets here and make my own assessment. Gideon was quiet for a moment, then he nodded, once. All right. Go work on your ledger, she said. I'm going to remake this tea and go to bed. He picked up the ledger and stood. At the kitchen door, always doorways with him, he stopped. Clara. She looked up at the use of her given name, which was the first time he'd used it. I don't regret offering you the position, he said. I want that on record. Noted, she said. He went. She sat alone in the kitchen and remade her tea and drank it while it was still hot, which felt like a small but meaningful victory. The trouble with small victories was that they didn't stop what was coming. Dora Phelps was not the only front. There was also a man named Garrett Holloway, who ran the Blackbriar Courier, which was a 4-page weekly that covered land sales, weather, cattle prices, and what Garrett Holloway personally considered noteworthy. What Garrett Holloway considered noteworthy was, it turned out, heavily influenced by who bought advertising in the Courier, and Dora Phelps's husband Calvin was one of the larger buyers. The item ran on a Friday, in the 3rd column of the 2nd page, in the section that Holloway called Community Notes. Colt brought the paper back from town and put it on the kitchen table without saying anything, which told Clara everything she needed to know about what was in it before she read it. It did not name her directly. It was not the kind of thing that named people directly. It referred instead to the growing concern among community members regarding arrangements that test the standards of frontier decency, and to the unfortunate position of women who, through circumstances or choice, find themselves outside the bounds of respectable domestic order. There was a reference to the effect of such examples on the moral education of children in our community. Clara read it twice. Then she folded the paper in half, set it on the corner of the table, and finished the bread she was making. Pete came in an hour later and saw the paper. He picked it up, read the item, put it back down. His face had gone the color of a man who wanted to say something and was actually, for once, holding it back. "Don't," Clara said. "I wasn't going to cheat." "You were," she said, "and I appreciate it, but don't." He sat down heavily, watched her work for a moment. Then, "You know Gideon's going to see this." "I know." "He's going to be—" "I know," she said again. Gideon saw it that afternoon. She wasn't in the room when he read it, but she heard the quality of the silence from his study, which was a particular kind of silence. The kind that comes from someone very deliberately not reacting the way they want to react. He came to the kitchen before supper. He put the paper on the table with a controlled motion that was exactly controlled enough to tell her it had taken effort. "This won't be the last of it," he said. "I know. If you want to respond, responding gives it more weight," she said. "I know that too." He looked at her. There was something working in his face. Anger, she thought, but not at her. The kind of anger that has nowhere to go and knows it, which is the most frustrating kind. "I could speak to Holloway, which would confirm that you feel the need to defend the situation," she said, "which confirms that the situation is what they're saying it is in people's minds." He went quiet. She was right, and he knew it, and neither of them found that particularly satisfying. "Then what?" he said. "We wait for it to run its course?" "We do the work," she said. "We run an honest operation, and we do the work, and we let it run its course, yes." He was quiet for another moment. Then, with the careful tone of someone delivering a fact they'd been sitting with for a while. "There are people in this town, Clara, who have decided what you are, and I know from experience that those people are not moved by evidence." "Some of them aren't," she said. "But there are other people too. The ones who haven't decided yet. Those are the ones that matter." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't completely read, something between respect and something more complicated, something she deliberately didn't examine too closely. "Your bread is burning," he said. She turned around. It wasn't burning, but it was close. In the scramble to get it out of the oven, she knocked the folded newspaper off the table, and neither of them picked it up. Rose Hale arrived on a Wednesday in March, 6 weeks early, and 2 hours before anyone expected her, on the afternoon stage from Cheyenne. She came into the ranch in the back of the mail wagon, which was not the entrance Clara had been imagining, and she was smaller than Clara had pictured, sharp-faced, dark-eyed, like Gideon, with the particular set to her jaw of someone who has decided to be difficult before they arrive and is prepared to be consistent about it. She was 18 and she had lost both her parents within the same year. Clara held that fact deliberately in her mind when Rose walked through the kitchen door and looked at her with the direct, unflinching appraisal of a young woman who has decided that the best defense is to see everything clearly before anyone can use it against her. "You're the cook," Rose said. "I'm Clara Whitfield," Clara said. "Yes." Rose looked around the kitchen. Something moved through her expression when she registered the smell. Bread, coffee, the particular lived-in warmth of a room that was in regular use. It was there for just a moment, something young and unguarded, before the careful face came back. "Uncle Gideon said you'd been here a month," Rose said. "About 6 weeks," Claire said. "Sit down. I'll get you something to eat." "I'm not hungry." "You came from Cheyenne on the stage," Clara said. "Sit down." Rose sat down. She ate 2 biscuits and a bowl of stew with the focused efficiency of someone who was, in fact, very hungry and was not going to say so. Elias appeared in the kitchen doorway partway through this. He had a sense for when something interesting was happening that Clara had never fully explained. He looked at Rose. Rose looked at him. The particular mutual assessment of 2 young people encountering each other with no context. "Who are you?" Rose said. "Elias," he said. "Whitfield." "Her son?" "Yes." Rose considered this with her spoon. "How old are you?" 7, Elias said. "Almost 8. Are you sick?" He looked mildly offended. "I was. I'm not now. You look skinny." "Rose," Clara said mildly. "I'm just saying what I see," Rose said. Which was exactly, Clara thought, what Pete always said, and with exactly the same energy. Elias, who had apparently decided that directness was not a characteristic requiring offense, came fully into the kitchen and sat at the table. "There are kittens in the barn," he said to Rose, "if you want to see them." Rose looked at him for a moment. Something in her careful face shifted. Not much, but enough. "Maybe," she said. "They have names," Elias said. "I named them." "What are they?" He listed them. Rose listened, and something about the way she listened, with the particular sideways attention of someone trying not to show interest, reminded Clara strongly of the way Elias had watched Gideon that first day in town, that same careful, sideways, hopeful wariness. This girl was going to be fine, Clara thought. Not easy. Fine was different from easy, but fine. What she didn't know yet was that Rose's arrival would make everything worse before it got better, because Rose, for all her sharpness, was also 18 and grieving and had ears that picked up everything people said about her uncle's household, and opinions about what she heard that she expressed without the patience for strategy or timing. And in a town that had already made up its mind about Hale's arrangement, an 18-year-old girl defending her uncle's honor in the middle of Fulton's general store was exactly the kind of accelerant a fire like this didn't need. But that was still 3 weeks away. For now, Rose Hale sat in the kitchen at Hale's Cross, eating biscuits she hadn't admitted she wanted, while a 7-year-old boy described 4 kittens to her in serious detail, and the late winter light came through the windows, and the range kept the room the temperature of somewhere worth being. Clara washed the stew pot and listened to them, and told herself that some things, even the difficult ones, were worth holding on to. She mostly believed it. The incident at Fulton's happened on a Thursday, which Clara would later think was at least consistent. Thursdays had never been a particularly reliable day either. Rose had been at the ranch 3 weeks by then, and the household had rearranged itself around her the way water rearranges itself around a new stone in a creek. Not without resistance, not without some turbulence, but eventually finding a way through. Rose was not easy. Clara had promised herself she wouldn't expect easy, and Rose had kept that promise for her with considerable dedication. She argued about the kitchen schedule. She had opinions about how the eggs should be cooked that she delivered with the confidence of someone who had never actually cooked eggs. She took up space in rooms the way some people do, not through size, but through the specific gravity of someone who has decided that if the world is going to be difficult, she will be difficult right back. She was also, underneath all of it, so visibly lonely that it was sometimes hard to look at her directly. Elias had figured this out before anyone else, which was consistent with his general approach to people. He had simply started including her in things. In the kitten reports, in the small observations about ranch life that he narrated to whoever was nearby. And Rose, who clearly had no idea how to refuse a 7-year-old's company without feeling terrible about it, had gradually stopped trying. By the end of the second week, she was helping him build something near the barn that Clara couldn't fully identify, but that both of them considered important. What Rose had not done was make peace with Clara. Not openly hostile. She was too smart for open hostility, and too proud to be caught being petty. But there was a particular quality to the way she moved in the kitchen when Clara was working, a careful maintenance of distance that said more than argument would have. She ate Clara's food, she used the kitchen, she just made sure none of it looked like gratitude. Clara let it be. She had raised a child through fever and grief and relocation and the specific misery of being 7 years old in a strange place with a sick body and a frightened mother. She could manage the studied indifference of an 18-year-old. What she hadn't managed well enough was the town. 3 weeks of Rose's presence had been 3 weeks of additional exposure. Rose went to town with Gideon twice, and both times she came back with the tightly held expression of someone who had heard something and was deciding what to do with it. Clara had seen that expression before, on people who were building towards something. She had not moved fast enough to get in front of it. The Thursday in question started as a supply run. Gideon needed to go to the land office again. The water rights negotiation had entered a phase that required his physical presence and a great deal of patience, neither of which he had in abundance. And Rose had said she wanted to come. Clara needed things from Fulton's. The arrangement was that they would all go together and the women would handle the shopping while Gideon was at the land office, and they would meet at the wagon at noon. Clara's list was short. She was moving through it efficiently, aware of Rose beside her in the way you're aware of a storm system that hasn't decided yet what it's going to do. Fulton was behind his counter. There were 3 other people in the store. A man Clara didn't know examining rope, and 2 women near the fabric section that she did know, because they were 2 of the 3 who had been watching from the boardwalk on the day she arrived. Their names, she had learned, were Helen Marsh and Florence Cade. Helen was the blacksmith's wife, which was a piece of information she'd connected with some interest, since it was Abel Marsh who had fixed the firebox door on the range. Florence Cade was the wife of one of the men on the town board, which connected her more directly to the Phelps sphere of operation. They saw Clara the moment she and Rose came in. The response was the practiced one: eyes that moved away, a slight physical realignment, a resumption of conversation that had not actually been interrupted but now took on the quality of being performed. Clara went to the counter with her list. The trouble started quietly, as trouble usually does. Helen Marsh said something to Florence Cade in the kind of voice that is not quite a whisper, the kind that is designed to carry just far enough, designed to be heard without being directly addressed. Clara couldn't hear the specific words, but she heard the tone, which was sufficient, and she saw Rose, standing 3 feet to her left, go absolutely still. "Rose," Clara said quietly. "The flour." Rose didn't move. "The flour," Clara said again, 20 pounds, on the bottom shelf behind you. What happened next was the result of 3 weeks of accumulated frustration and 6 months of grief and 18 years of being a person who, as Gideon had told her, did not keep her opinions to herself. Rose turned around, not toward the flour, toward Helen Marsh and Florence Cade. "I heard what you said," Rose said. Florence Cade blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "I said I heard you." Rose's voice was controlled, which made it worse somehow, more like Gideon than Clara had expected. "About my uncle's household, about Mrs. Whitfield." Helen Marsh pressed her lips together. "This is not the place." "You made it the place when you said it loud enough for me to hear," Rose said. "So let me say something back." She was not shouting. She was doing the opposite of shouting, which in a small quiet room was considerably more effective. "Mrs. Whitfield cooks for our household. She manages our stores and our kitchen and the accounts for both, and she does it honestly and well. That's the arrangement. That's all the arrangement is." Her jaw was tight. "And if you've got something to say about my uncle's character, I'd appreciate you saying it to his face rather than in a dry goods store to someone who can't defend himself." The room was entirely silent. "That was very improper," Florence Cade said finally, in the voice of someone reaching for the only weapon available. "I'm sure it was," Rose said, and turned back to the shelf, pulling down the 20-pound sack of flour with the contained motion of someone who is not going to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her hands shake. Clara had not moved during any of this. She had stood at the counter with her list, watching Fulton pretend to be absorbed by something beneath the counter, feeling the specific complicated mix of gratitude and dread that Rose's intervention had produced. Because Rose wasn't wrong, and Rose had also just made everything significantly more complicated. Gideon met them at the wagon at noon. He took one look at Clara's face and then at Rose's face and said, "What happened?" "Nothing I regret," Rose said, climbing onto the wagon without elaboration. Clara looked at Gideon. "There was an incident in Fulton's," she said. "Define incident." Rose defended the household to Helen Marsh and Florence Cade publicly. Gideon closed his eyes for approximately 2 seconds. "Rose." "I'd do it again, like," Rose said from the wagon seat, looking at the street ahead. "I know you would," he said. "That's the problem." He rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture Clara had come to recognize as his version of collecting himself. "Get in the wagon. I need to think." They drove back to the ranch with considerably less conversation than they'd driven in with. Rose sat with her arms crossed, the expression of someone who is not sorry and is not going to perform being sorry. Clara sat between them, calculating. She had known, sitting in the kitchen 2 weeks ago while Gideon talked about water rights and town board influence, that the situation had a weight limit. She had thought she had more time before that limit was reached. Rose's intervention, well-intentioned, honest, exactly the kind of thing Clara might have done herself at 18 before she'd learned that the truth said in the wrong room at the wrong moment often became a weapon in someone else's hands, had moved the timeline forward. She spent the rest of that day going through the numbers in her head, the way she did with the pantry inventory. What she had, what she owed, what it would cost to leave, and where that cost would fall. The next 2 days were quiet in the way that weather is quiet before something that isn't. Colt came in on Friday morning with the compressed expression of a man who had heard something in town and was deciding whether to say it. He said it, eventually, after his second cup of coffee, because Colt's fundamental honesty always won out over his instinct for diplomacy. Calvin Phelps talked to Jim Carver at the land office, he said, about the water rights proceeding. Gideon had gone still. He didn't threaten anything direct, Colt said. It was more in the way of reminding Jim Carver that community standing is part of how those decisions get made, which everybody already knew. He turned his cup. But saying it out loud is different from everybody knowing it. Clara didn't look at Gideon. She kept her hands on the bread she was making, pressing the dough with the methodical pressure of something that required her full attention. She had been turning a decision over for 2 days like a stone in a pocket, feeling the edges of it. She did not want to make it. She had not wanted to make it from the moment it had become a possibility, because the wanting was exactly the problem. She wanted to stay badly enough that she didn't trust her own reasons for doing so. That evening, she put Elias to bed. He had been quieter than usual over the past few days, which meant he was feeling the house's tension in the way he felt everything, completely and without showing it. He asked her while she was tucking in the blanket, "Are we leaving?" She looked at him. "What makes you ask that?" "People leave when things get hard," he said, with the flat, factual tone of a child reporting observed data. "Not always," she said, but sometimes," he said. She looked at her son's face, serious, watchful, with the particular exhausted wisdom of a child who has moved too many times to be fooled by the early stages of another departure. "Get some sleep," she said. She went downstairs through the kitchen and found Gideon in his study, which was unusual. He was at his desk with the ledger open but not writing in it, which meant he was sitting with his own version of the same calculation. She sat down in the chair across from his desk, which she had never done before. He looked up. "I've been thinking about something," she said. "So have I," he said. "I'm going to say mine first," she said. He put down his pencil. "I think I should go back to town," she said. "Not permanently. Back to town and find work there. Something that doesn't put your water rights or your standing at risk. I can find something, and this—" She paused because the next part was harder to say than she'd expected. "The work here is good, and I'm not ready to call it a failure, but I'm also not willing to be the reason your ranch goes under. That's not a trade I'm able to make." He looked at her for a long moment. "Are you finished?" "Yes." "That's the worst solution I've heard in recent memory," he said. "And I've been in a room with Pete for 7 years. It's practical. It's retreat," he said. "And it's retreat that leaves you in a worse position than when you arrived, which means it's not actually practical. It just looks like it." He stood up from behind the desk, which was what he did when he needed to not be sitting. "If you go back to town with no references and a situation that people have already decided the story of, you'll have a harder time finding work than you did when you arrived. And Elias—" "Don't," she said quietly. "Don't use Elias to make the argument." He stopped. "You're right. I'm sorry." He went to the window. "I just think you've done the arithmetic on the wrong problem." "What's the right problem?" He turned. "The problem isn't that you're here. The problem is that the people with influence in this town have decided to make your being here into something it isn't, and I've been responding to that by trying not to give them more ammunition, which has meant doing nothing. And doing nothing," he said, "has not been working." Clara looked at him. "What are you planning?" "I'm going to town tomorrow," he said. "There's something I should have done 2 weeks ago." "Gideon." "Go to bed, Clara," he said, not unkindly, with the specific tone of someone who has made a decision and is now committed to it. "I'll tell you in the morning." He didn't tell her in the morning. He was gone before she was up, which was the first time that had happened since she'd arrived. She found the note on the kitchen table, 2 sentences in his compact handwriting. Gone to town. Back by noon. She made breakfast. She fed the men. Rose came down and looked at the empty seat at the table and looked at Clara with the particular sharpness of someone who understands more than they've been told. "Where is he?" Rose said. "Town," Clara said. "Why?" "He didn't elaborate," Clara said, in the tone that meant stop asking. Rose sat down. Pete opened his mouth. Colt looked at Pete. Pete closed his mouth. They ate breakfast with the particular uncomfortable awareness of people waiting for something to happen. What happened was this. Gideon Hale walked into Fulton's general store at 9:15 in the morning when it was well populated with the usual mid-morning traffic of housewives and merchants and men doing the slow business of a Friday. He walked to the counter where Fulton himself was dealing with two customers. He waited his turn with the patience of someone who has decided on a course of action and is no longer second-guessing it. When Fulton looked at him, Gideon said, in a voice that carried without being raised, "I need to see the debt ledger for the Whitfield account." The store went quiet in pieces, closest to the counter first, then spreading. Fulton said, "Mr. Hale, I don't think—" "The debt ledger for Thomas Whitfield's account," Gideon said. "I know it's been transferred to you from Harlan County. I know the amount. I'd like to settle it." Now the store was fully quiet. Fulton produced the ledger. He had the look of a man who wanted to handle this privately and understood that the moment had moved past private. He showed Gideon the balance, $112, the portion of Thomas Whitfield's commercial debts that had followed Clara to Blackbriar and been shared through the particular informal network of merchants who kept track of such things. Gideon looked at it. He reached into his coat and counted out the money. Not quickly, not theatrically, but with the deliberate thoroughness of someone making sure a thing is done completely. There were 7 people in Fulton's when he did this. By noon, there were 20 people in Blackbriar who knew about it. By supper, 30. He didn't make a speech. That was the thing Clara would think about afterward, when she heard the account from no fewer than 3 different sources over the following days. He did not explain himself. He did not defend her character or denounce her critics. He paid the debt, took the receipt, and then said, and this was what people repeated. This was the sentence that moved through the town. He said to Fulton and the room at large, "If Mrs. Whitfield comes back to work at my ranch, it will be because she decides to, not because she owes anything to anyone." Then he left. He arrived back at the ranch at 12:30, which was 30 minutes past noon and well into the window of time Clara had spent failing to do anything productive while watching the road through the kitchen window. When she heard the wagon, she went outside without quite deciding to. He climbed down. He had the look of a man who has done something he'd rather not discuss. "What did you do?" she said. He told her. She stood in the yard and listened, and when he was done, she was quiet for long enough that he started to look uncomfortable, which was an expression she hadn't seen on him before, and which meant something different than all his other expressions. "You paid Thomas's debt," she said. "Yes." "Without telling me." "I told you I was going to town." "That is not the same thing," she said, and her voice had a quality she hadn't intended, not anger, or not only anger, something more complicated than anger. "Gideon, that money is not a debt you owe me," he said. "I want to be clear about that. That's not what this is." "Then what is it?" He looked at her directly, the way he did when he was not going to manage the truth into something easier. "It's me making a public statement," he said, "about what this situation actually is, in terms people understand." "People will think you bought me," she said. "Some people will think that," he said. "The people who've already decided to think the worst, yes. But the ones who haven't, the ones who were watching and waiting to see what kind of man I am and what kind of woman you are, those people saw something different." She looked at him. The afternoon light was doing something specific to the yard. The kind of late winter light that was cold and honest and didn't flatter anything. "What about the water rights?" she said. "Calvin Phelps and the board—" "Let me worry about that." "Gideon." "Clara." He said her name the same way he had that first time in the kitchen, with the weight of someone who doesn't use words carelessly. "I've been careful for 2 months. I've been careful and measured, and I've let people say things that weren't true because I was trying to manage the situation quietly, and it didn't work." He paused. "So I stopped being careful." She pressed her hand against her mouth for a moment, not to stop herself from speaking, but because she needed to do something with the feeling that had no good place to go. "I don't want to be something you fixed," she said finally. "I've been that before. I know what it costs." "You're not," he said. "You're someone I made a public statement for. There's a difference." "Which is?" "I didn't do it so you'd feel obligated," he said. "I did it so you'd have a choice, a real one, without a debt hanging on either side of it." He met her eyes. "You can stay because it's where you want to be. You can go because it's what you decide. But I didn't want the decision made by something Thomas Whitfield did 3 years ago." Clara stood in the yard of Hale's Cross in the cold March light and looked at the man in front of her. A man who mended his own coat with mismatched thread and made bad coffee and appeared in doorways before entering rooms and had, apparently, walked into a general store full of people and paid a dead man's debt for no reason other than the one he'd just given her. She thought about Elias saying people leave when things get hard. She thought about the kitchen door that opened both ways. She thought about $31.40 in a boot and a letter that had gone soft at the folds, and a boarding house door, and a single step backward that had felt, at the time, like the end of something. "You humiliated yourself in front of half the town," she said. "I've survived worse," he said. "You might lose the water rights." "I might," he agreed. "I had the water rights before you came, and if I lose them, I'll find another way. I've been finding other ways since my father died, and I was 23 and had no idea what I was doing." He paused. "The water rights are not the point." "Then what is?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said simply, "You are." It was not a declaration. He did not say it like a declaration. He said it like a fact he'd been sitting with and had decided to put on the table, the way he did with everything, directly, without drama, without any apparent expectation that it would change the weather. Clara looked at him for a long time. Behind her in the house, she could hear Rose moving in the kitchen, and the distant sound of Elias somewhere near the barn, and the creek running along the eastern edge of the property, low and constant and indifferent to all of it. "I have to think," she said. "All right," he said. He went to the barn. She stood in the yard a while longer, alone in the cold light, thinking about a choice that was finally, actually hers to make. She didn't sleep that night. Not in the dramatic way of someone tormented. She wasn't pacing, wasn't crying, wasn't doing any of the things that sleeplessness looked like from the outside. She simply lay in the dark of her room off the kitchen and stared at the ceiling and let the thinking happen, which was different from forcing it. Forcing decisions had never served her well. Thomas had been a forced decision, or close enough to it. She had been 22 and her options had seemed narrow, and he had seemed like the widest of them, and she had talked herself into it with the particular efficiency of a person who has already decided and is looking for reasons rather than answers. She was not going to do that again. The ranch was quiet in the way it got after 10 o'clock, the specific deep quiet of a working place at rest, the animals settled, the men in the bunkhouse, the creek doing its indifferent work in the dark. She could hear Elias breathing through the wall. The sound of it had been, for the past 3 months, the thing she used to locate herself when everything else felt unlocatable. He was here. He was breathing without the rattle. That was the fixed point. She thought about what Gideon had said. "You are." 2 words, said like a fact, with no theater around them. She had been told she mattered before, by Thomas, in the early years. In the way Thomas said things, with warmth and ease and the slight performance of a man who understood the value of being well-liked. Gideon had said those 2 words the way he nailed a loose board, because it needed to be said, and he was the one standing there with the hammer. She thought about the water rights, about Calvin Phelps, and the board, and the newspaper item, and Helen Marsh's voice and Fulton's, and all of it, the machinery of a town's judgment, which was real, which had weight, which had already damaged things and could damage more. She was not naive about this. She had lived inside the machinery of other people's opinions for the past year, and she knew exactly how much it cost. She also knew something else, which was harder to hold and easier to dismiss, and which she had been dismissing since the day she arrived at Hale's Cross, because the alternative was too large to look at directly. She had not felt this way about a place since she was a child in her mother's house. That uncomplicated sense of here, of a room that was hers to be in, of a kitchen that had learned her habits, and a range that she knew the particular quirks of, and a table where a 7-year-old boy named Kittens and an 18-year-old girl slowly, grudgingly, without admitting it, was becoming something like herself again. She could leave. She could make the practical argument and leave, and it would be reasonable and defensible, and she would spend the rest of her life knowing she had made the safe choice instead of the true one. She thought about Elias saying, "This is a good place," with the certainty of a child who doesn't say things he doesn't mean. She made her decision somewhere around 2 in the morning, not as a dramatic moment, but as a settling, the way a house settles into its foundation after the lumber has finished contracting. Quiet. Definite. Done. She got up and made herself tea and sat in the kitchen in the dark until the range got going, and then she made breakfast. Gideon came down at his usual time. He saw her at the range and stopped in the doorway, always the doorways, with the expression of a man who cannot read the situation and is too honest to pretend he can. "Coffee's ready," she said. He poured himself a cup. He sat down. He waited. "I'm staying," she said. "Not because of what you did in town, not because of the debt, or what you said to Fulton, or any of it. I'm staying because this is where I want to be, and I've spent a year making decisions based on what was safe instead of what was true, and I'm done with that." He was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. "Is that all you've got?" she said. Something moved in his face, the closest thing to undone she'd seen on him. "I'm glad," he said. "I'm genuinely glad. I just—" He stopped. "I'm better at problems than at good news. I don't always know what to do with good news." "Drink your coffee," she said. "That's what you do with it." He drank his coffee. Colt came in and read the room with the efficiency of a man who had spent 7 years learning to read Gideon Hale's kitchen, and simply said, "Morning," and sat down, and that was that. Pete came in and said, "You look less terrible than yesterday," to Clara, which from Pete was a meaningful upgrade. Rose came in last, which she always did, and looked at Clara with her sharp, dark eyes for a moment, and then looked at Gideon, and then, with the slightly painful expression of someone doing something that doesn't come naturally, she said to Clara, "Is there anything that needs doing before breakfast?" Clara looked at her. "The table could use setting," she said. Rose set the table without another word, but she set it properly, all the way around, including the salt and the butter dish, which nobody had asked her to do. It was not an apology. Rose Hale was not the kind of person who apologized directly, any more than Gideon was. But it was something, and Clara took it for what it was. The days that followed were not suddenly easier in the way that stories sometimes suggest. As if a decision, once made, smooths out the road ahead of it. The road did not smooth. Calvin Phelps did, in fact, make things difficult with the water rights proceeding, through Jim Carver at the land office, through the particular indirect pressure that men like Calvin Phelps had developed into an art form. Gideon spent 2 weeks in a sustained, grinding negotiation that aged him visibly and required 3 trips to the land office and 1 trip to the county seat that kept him away overnight. He came back from the county seat on a Wednesday evening, late, when Clara had kept supper warm on the range for 2 hours past, when she should have been able to justify it. He came through the kitchen door with the look of a man who has won something at considerable cost, and sat down and ate the food she put in front of him without saying anything for a while. "The water rights are settled," he said finally. "In your favor?" "In my favor." He looked at his plate. "Took 3 witnesses to Carver's office and a letter from the territorial surveyor's office and more patience than I currently have a reserve of. But yes." Clara sat down across from him. "Phelps?" "Phelps pushed as far as he could push," Gideon said. "Turns out the limit of how far that is has something to do with the actual law, which doesn't care what Phelps thinks about my household arrangements." He was quiet for a moment. "He'll find another way to be difficult. He's that kind of man. But this particular thing is done." Clara let out a breath she had been holding, she realized, for about 2 weeks. "You should have told me it was this bad," she said. "You had enough to manage," he said. "Gideon." She used his name the way he used hers, with the weight of meaning something specific. "We are not going to manage things separately and call it protecting each other. That's not how this works." He looked at her across the table. "How does it work?" "You tell me what's happening," she said. "I tell you what's happening. We're in the same house, and we're running the same operation, and if you treat me like something that needs to be shielded from bad news, that's not respect. That's just a different kind of condescension." He considered this. He had the expression of a man encountering an argument he can't find a flaw in and isn't sure how he feels about that. "Fair," he said finally. "Good," she said. "Eat your supper." He ate his supper. What changed after that was harder to name than a single event. It was accumulative, the way most real things are, built from small mornings and shared accounts, and the ordinary friction of people figuring out how to exist in the same space without smoothing themselves down to nothing. Clara learned that Gideon had a particular stubbornness about the south fence that made no rational sense but was apparently non-negotiable. He learned that she had a way of going very quiet when she was angry. That was more alarming than shouting would have been, and that required being addressed directly rather than waited out. Rose was the unexpected variable in all of it. She had come to the ranch carrying her grief like a second coat, heavy, worn over everything, making all her movements slightly stiff. She was not over it, and Clara was not going to pretend she should be, 3 months after losing the last of her parents. But somewhere in the long Wyoming winter, between the kittens and Elias's patient narration of ranch life and the kitchen that was warm when she came downstairs in the mornings, something in Rose had started to put the coat down. Not all the way, just enough. She started helping in the kitchen without being asked. Not grandly, small things, practical things. She would notice the bread needed watching and watch it. She would see Clara's hands were full and take the pot to the table. She never commented on this, and Clara never thanked her in a way that would require acknowledgement, because they had both apparently understood without discussing it that this was how it was going to work between them. The conversation, when it finally came, was not the one Clara had been preparing for. It was an April evening, cool, but with the first suggestion of something warmer beneath it, the way Wyoming spring felt, tentative, like it wasn't sure it was allowed yet. Elias had gone to bed. Gideon and the men were dealing with a fence situation on the east property line that had taken all day and would probably take tomorrow as well. Clara was at the kitchen table with the household accounts. Rose was somewhere she thought was not the kitchen, until she heard the door and turned and found her standing there with 2 cups of tea, extending one without explanation. Clara took it. Rose sat down across from her. For a moment she just drank her tea, looking at the table. "My mother would have hated this," Rose said. Clara looked at her. "Hated what specifically?" "This," Rose gestured vaguely. "The situation. A woman living in my uncle's house." She said it without venom, just as a statement of fact about a person Clara had never met. She had very strong opinions about how things should look from the outside. "And the inside?" Clara said. Rose was quiet for a moment. "I think she was less certain about the inside," she said. "She just didn't say that." She turned her cup. She wasn't a bad person. She was a person who was afraid a lot of the time, and the way she dealt with being afraid was to make everything into a rule. If there were enough rules, things couldn't go wrong. Clara thought about Thomas. About her own particular version of the same logic. If she was competent enough, organized enough, careful enough, things wouldn't go wrong. "That never quite works," she said. "No," Rose said. "It doesn't." They sat with that for a moment, which was the kind of moment that either goes awkward or goes somewhere else, and this one went somewhere else. "He's different since you came," Rose said. "My uncle." Clara looked at her carefully. "Different how?" "Less like he's just managing things," Rose said. She appeared to be choosing words with more care than she usually bothered with, which meant this mattered to her. Before, he would come in from the barn and eat supper and work on the ledger, and it was fine. He's always been fine. He's good at fine. She looked at Clara directly with those dark eyes that were so much like Gideon's. But now he laughs sometimes. Not often, but sometimes. And he asks Elias questions about the kittens like he's actually interested in the answers. She paused. "I don't know what to do with that yet. I'm still figuring it out." "You don't have to do anything with it," Clara said. "I know," Rose said. "I know that. I just wanted you to know I noticed." It was the most Rose had said to her in a single sitting, and it was probably, Clara thought, the most Rose was going to say for a while. She didn't push it. She drank her tea and let the silence be the comfortable kind, and Rose stayed at the table until her cup was empty, and then went to bed without making anything of it. Clara sat with the accounts and the quiet house, and thought about a girl who was figuring out what to do with someone else's happiness. She thought it was probably the most honest thing anyone had said to her in months. Spring came in pieces. The creek ran higher. The cottonwoods on the ridge went from yellow to a young, vivid green that seemed almost aggressive after the long gray of winter. The kittens left the barn and began conducting unauthorized expeditions into the yard, which Elias monitored with the seriousness of a field commander. Elias himself had filled out. It was gradual enough that she almost missed it, the way you don't notice a child growing until you see them next to something that hasn't changed. He was still quiet, still watchful, still the boy who observed before he spoke. But he had stopped carrying himself with the careful economy of someone who wasn't sure they'd be staying. His shoulders were different. His laugh, which had been rare and slightly startled sounding in the fall, had become something more settled. He had also, sometime around the middle of April, started following Colt around. Colt had apparently decided this was acceptable because he let it happen without comment, adjusting his pace when the boy was beside him, answering questions when they came, which was frequently. Clara watched this from the kitchen window sometimes and thought about the particular way that men who aren't naturally good with children sometimes turn out to be exactly what a child needs. Not the performed warmth of someone trying, but the matter-of-fact inclusion of someone who has simply decided the child is worth their time. On a Saturday morning in late April, Gideon came to the kitchen while Clara was going over the food stores for the coming week. He stood in the doorway. She didn't look up because she knew his weight by now, the particular way the floorboard near the door responded to it. "There's something I want to ask you," he said. "Ask," she said, marking something in the ledger. He came in and sat down, not at his usual place at the end of the table, but at the chair directly across from her, which was Rose's chair at meals, and not where he usually sat. She looked up at that. His expression was the carefully controlled one, which she had learned meant the opposite of what it looked like. It didn't mean he was calm. It meant the thing he was feeling was large enough that he was being deliberate about every part of the presentation. "I'm going to say this plainly," he said, "because I don't know another way to say it, and I've been trying to find one for about 3 weeks. She put down her pencil. "I would like you to marry me," he said, "not because of the talk in town, and not because it makes the household arrangement more defensible, and not because of anything except what I'm going to say next." He paused. "I want you here. Not as the cook, not as the woman who manages the stores and fixes what's broken and keeps this place from going to ruin, although you do all of that, and I am aware of it. I want you here because this house is better with you in it, and because Elias is—" He stopped, started again. "Because Elias deserves to grow up somewhere he doesn't have to keep watching the road. And because when I walk in from the barn, I notice whether you're in the kitchen, and that's been true since about the 3rd week, and I'm tired of not saying it." Clara looked at him across the table. This man with mismatched thread in his coat and bad coffee habits, and a fundamental inability to say an easy thing when a true one was available. This man who had watched a door slam in her face and offered honest work. Who had paid a dead man's debt in a room full of witnesses, not to buy her, but to free her. Who laughed sometimes, not often, at Elias's kitten reports. "That's not a small thing you're asking," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not trying to make it small." "I come with complications," she said. "I come with a 7-year-old who is not your responsibility and a history in this town that is not going to vanish because of a marriage certificate and opinions about kitchens that I will not be changing." "I know," he said again. "And I'm—" She stopped, said the harder thing. "I'm not easy to be with. I have been told that before, and I think the people who told me were probably right. I have opinions about things, and I say them, and I don't handle being managed, and I need to be spoken to like someone who can be told the truth, even when it's bad." "I've noticed," he said, with the almost smile. "I find that significantly preferable to the alternative." She was quiet for a moment. "What's the alternative?" "Someone who doesn't notice things," he said. "I've been around people who don't notice things. I prefer the version of my life that comes with someone who does." Clara pressed her hands flat on the table, thought about a boarding house door, thought about $31.40, thought about this is a good place and the weight of a sleeping boy on her lap in a wagon and a kitchen door that had been promised to open both ways. She thought about choosing, not surviving, not managing, not making the best of a situation that had narrowed down to one reasonable option. Choosing, freely, with her eyes open, knowing the complications and the costs and the particular imperfection of every person in the equation, including herself. "Yes," she said. He looked at her as if he wanted to make sure he'd heard correctly. "Yes," she said again, with the decisiveness of someone who has made a decision and is not going to unmake it. Something in his face shifted, not dramatically, not in the way of a man given to demonstrations. Just the particular quality of held tension that releases when a thing you weren't sure of becomes sure. He reached across the table, and she put her hand in his, and they sat there for a moment in the kitchen of Hales Cross in the late April morning, with the range warm and the creak audible, and the kittens doing whatever the kittens were doing outside. "We should tell Elias," she said. "Yes," he said. He'll have questions. I expect so. And Rose will have opinions, Gideon said. She always has opinions. She'll come around, Clara said. She's been coming around since March. She just won't admit it yet. He almost smiled. That's a Hale quality. I noticed, Clara said. They found Elias near the barn, supervising Penny's investigation of a fence post with the focused attention of a livestock manager. He looked up when they came and looked at their hands, which were still loosely joined, and looked at their faces. He was 7, nearly 8. He noticed things, this boy. He had noticed things since before he had words for noticing. Elias, Clara said, Mr. Hale has something to tell you. Gideon crouched down to the boy's level, which was something Clara had seen him do exactly once before. When he'd explained to Elias why the east fence needed staying clear of during cattle movement, he did it the same way, without condescension, just as someone leveling the field of a conversation. I've asked your mother to marry me, Gideon said, and she said yes. I wanted you to hear it from us, not from someone else. Elias looked at him, looked at Clara, looked at Gideon again with the sideways intensity that meant the full processing apparatus was engaged. Would we stay here? He said. Yes, Gideon said. On the ranch. Yes. Would the kittens stay? Gideon looked at Clara with an expression that was lost somewhere between genuine uncertainty and something that was entirely amusement. The kittens, he said carefully, are barn cats. So yes. Elias considered this full picture for a moment that felt longer than it probably was. Then he said, Okay. Okay, Clara said. Yes, Elias said, with the simplicity of someone for whom the important questions have been answered. He went back to monitoring Penny. Gideon stood up and looked at Clara. That was easier than expected, he said. He's been watching you for 5 months, she said. He made his decision a while ago. Rose's reaction was, as predicted, more complicated. She heard the news that evening before supper, told by Clara directly, privately, in the kitchen, which was the right way, and went through a rapid sequence of expressions that included surprise, something that might have been fear, and something else that Clara could not name, but recognized as the look of a person rearranging a large amount of internal furniture quickly. This is your house, Clara said quietly, before Rose could speak. That does not change. I want you to know that first. Rose looked at her. You came here because this is your family's ranch, Clara said. Because your uncle is your family, and this is your home. I am not here to displace that. I'm here because, she paused, said the honest thing. Because I love him, I think. I'm still getting used to what that looks like in a person like me. But I want you to know that I understand what this house means to you, and I am not going to be careless with it. Rose was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, You think? What? You said you think you love him, Rose said. And there was something in her voice that was wary and young, and also, underneath, trying hard not to be touched by what Clara had said. I think, Clara said, that love in my experience has looked like the kind of thing that announces itself loudly and turns out to mean less than it sounded. What I feel is quieter than that. She considered. It's the kind of thing that made me stay when leaving was easier. I'm choosing to call that love. Rose looked at her for a long moment. Then she turned to the range and picked up the pot and said, with her back turned, The coffee needs making before supper. I know, Clara said. I'll make it, Rose said. It was not an embrace. It was not even a direct statement of anything, but in the language that Rose and Clara had been building quietly all winter. The language of things done instead of said, of small practical acts standing in for larger, harder feelings. It was exactly enough. Clara let her make the coffee and set the table, and called the men in for supper, and sat down at a table that held Gideon across from her and Elias at the bench, and Rose with her opinions, and Pete with his mouth, and Colt with his steady, patient presence, and felt, with the specific, unshowy, unassuming solidity of something that had been built piece by piece out of real material, that she was home, not because it was perfect, not because anything had been resolved cleanly or concluded without cost, but because she had chosen it completely and deliberately with the full knowledge of what it was. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything. They were married on a Friday in May, which Clara thought was at least an improvement over Tuesdays. It was not a large wedding. Neither of them wanted large, Gideon because he was constitutionally uncomfortable with events designed around his own feelings, and Clara because she had spent enough of the past year being looked at by strangers and had no appetite for more of it. They went to the justice of the peace in Blackbriar, a quiet man named Aldous Webb, who had the sensible quality of a person who understood that the ceremony was not the point and moved through it accordingly. Colt stood as witness. Rose stood beside Clara, in a blue dress she had pressed herself that morning without being asked, her face arranged into the expression of someone attending something important and managing their feelings about it with concentrated effort. Elias stood directly in front of them both, which was not traditional, but also not something anyone had tried to prevent. He watched the proceedings with his arms at his sides and his full attention forward, the way he watched everything that mattered. When Aldous Webb said the words that made it done, Elias said, quietly but audibly, "Good," which made Colt's mouth compress in the way it did when he was suppressing something. Pete was not there. Pete had been given the specific task of staying at the ranch and watching the fence situation on the south property line, which was a real task and also a diplomatic solution to the problem of Pete's complete inability to keep his responses to significant events internal. Clara had explained this to Pete directly, and Pete had looked briefly wounded and then said, "Yeah, that's fair," which was one of the more self-aware things she'd heard him say. They came back to the ranch by noon. Pete had made an attempt at a celebratory cake, which sat on the kitchen table with the slightly collapsed dignity of something that had been ambitious in conception and humbling in execution. It tasted better than it looked, which Clara told him, and which Pete received with the transparent gratitude of someone who had put more effort into a thing than they planned to admit. "It's a good cake, Pete," Elias said earnestly, with a second piece on his plate. "It really isn't," Pete said, "but thank you for saying so." Gideon ate 2 slices without comment, which was its own kind of statement. That evening, after the household had settled and Elias was in bed and the men were in the bunkhouse, Clara stood in the kitchen washing the cake pan and thought that this was, against all reasonable expectation, exactly what she'd wanted. Not the wedding, the evening after it. The ordinary weight of the pan in her hands, the sound of the ranch at rest, the knowledge that the man in the next room reading ledgers was someone she had chosen with her eyes open and her judgment intact. The unglamorous, uncelebrated fact of it. She had had the glamorous version once, the wedding with the flowers and the dress and Thomas's easy charm filling the room, and she knew what that was worth. This was worth more. She was sure of it. What she was less sure of was what came next, which was the thing she could not have predicted, and which arrived not with drama, but with the slow accumulation of months. The town changed. Not all at once, and not completely, and not without resistance from the quarters that had made up their minds and preferred their decisions stay made. But it changed, the way most real things change, in the small increments that only become visible when you step back far enough to see the whole of them. It started, as these things sometimes do, with something practical. There was a woman named Sadie Greer who lived on a dry soil claim about 6 miles east of Blackbriar with her husband and 4 children. The Greers had been on that claim for 3 years and were in the particular position of people who had not failed yet, but were close enough to failure that the difference was mostly determination and luck had been sparse. In July, her husband broke his leg badly coming off a horse. Not a killing injury, but a long one. 6 weeks of no useful work during the season when everything that mattered happened. Clara heard about it from Colt, who heard about it from the man who delivered mail, who had no opinion about it other than that it was a bad piece of luck for a family that didn't have surplus luck to spend. Clara thought about it for 2 days and then made arrangements. She did not make a production of it. She packed a box, preserves from the cellar, a smoked joint of pork, dried beans, cornmeal, a jar of the lard she rendered herself, and she drove out to the Greer claim on a Tuesday morning. She had Elias with her, which was practical since school was not in session, and because Elias was the kind of company that didn't make a difficult situation worse. Sadie Greer answered the door with the expression of a woman who had been managing alone long enough that visitors were either a relief or a complication, and she was bracing for the second. When she saw the box, she said very quietly, "I don't take charity." "It's not charity," Clara said, with the same inflection she had used 7 months ago in a general store with a different woman. My cellar's running heavy, and I can't get through it all before the new harvest comes in. I'd rather it go somewhere useful." Sadie Greer looked at her for a moment, then she stepped back and let her in. They sat in Sadie's kitchen, which was smaller and harder used than Clara's own, but had the same fundamental quality of a room where someone was doing their best with available materials. Sadie's 4 children arranged themselves around Elias with the wary curiosity of young animals encountering something new. And Elias, who had been a solitary, watchful child for most of his life, simply sat down among them and began asking about the claim in the serious, interested way he had, and within 20 minutes was being shown the family's 3 chickens with the gravity of a proper tour. Clara stayed 2 hours. She came back the following week with more preserves, and the week after with a length of cloth she'd bought in town that she told Sadie she'd gotten too much of and couldn't use, which was true enough if you didn't examine it closely. By the 3rd week, Sadie had started talking, which was the point at which Clara understood that the food was not the main thing she'd been bringing. "People in town said things about you," Sadie said, on the 3rd visit. She said it directly, without cruelty. The way a person says something they've been carrying and have decided to put down. "When you came, and after. Dora Phelps had opinions." "Dora Phelps had a lot of opinions," Clara said. "She did," Sadie agreed. "She also brought food to my door once, the winter before last, when we were running short. So I don't know what to do with her entirely." She looked at her hands. "People aren't one thing." "No," Clara said. "They're not." Sadie looked at her. "I just wanted you to know I heard those things, and I didn't know what to believe, and now I've seen for myself what I think." She paused. "That's all I wanted to say." Clara didn't make more of it than it was. "Thank you," she said, and meant it plainly. The Greers were the beginning, not because Clara planned a campaign. She didn't. She was not that strategic about it. She was just a person who noticed when other people were in a version of her own situation. But the frontier had a way of cycling the same problems through different families. And Clara kept noticing and kept showing up with the particular combination of practical help and the dignity of not making it look like help. And over the course of that summer and into the fall, a thing happened that she had not engineered and could not entirely explain. People started coming to her, not the Phelps circle. That door stayed more or less shut, though even that had cracks, which she would get to. But the other people, the ones who hadn't decided, whom Gideon had mentioned that first day in the yard, the woman whose preserves hadn't set right and who appeared at the kitchen door one afternoon with the jars, and a look of combined desperation and embarrassment because she'd been doing this for 20 years and she wasn't going to ask for help, but she was out of ideas. The man from the North property who came to Gideon about a fence question and ended up in the kitchen because Clara happened to know something about the soil composition in that part of the territory that was relevant to the post-setting problem, and Gideon said without ceremony, "Tell her she knows more about the North section than I do." Elias started school in September. This had been a point of quiet tension all summer. Blackbriar's school was run by a man named Howard Finch, who had no particular relationship with the Phelps network, but who had heard things, as everyone in a small town hears things, and whose response to the Hale household had been a kind of careful neutrality that could tip either direction. Clara had gone to see him before school started, alone, with the specific purpose of having a direct conversation. She had sat across from Howard Finch in his schoolroom and said, My son is 8 years old and he was sick for most of last year, and he is the kind of child who learns things that interest him with complete dedication and struggles with things that don't engage him at all. He is not disruptive. He is quiet. He watches before he participates. I want you to know this before he walks through the door so that you have an accurate picture of him before you decide what you think. Howard Finch had listened to all of this and then said carefully, "Mrs. Hale, I'm going to be direct with you about something." "Please," she said. "I make judgments about children based on the children," he said, "not on their parents' situations. I believe that's my professional obligation and also simply the right way to operate." He paused. "I want you to know that before he walks through the door." Clara had looked at this man, mild-looking, thin, with the slightly ink-stained hands of someone who cared about the work, and felt something loosen that she hadn't fully known was tight. "Thank you," she said. "I'll send him Monday." Elias, who had approached the first day of school with the methodical stoicism of a general entering difficult terrain, came home on the second day with a friend named Will Greer, who was Sadie Greer's oldest boy and who had apparently bonded with Elias over a shared and intense interest in how things worked mechanically. They sat at the kitchen table with the remaining kittens observing from the windowsill. Penny still held her position as Elias's particular favorite, and had expanded her territory from barn to kitchen with the confidence of an animal who knows she is indulged, and took apart and reassembled the broken clock mechanism that Clara had been keeping in the back of the supply drawer for 6 months without knowing what to do with it. She watched them from the range and thought about Sadie Greer's kitchen, and about the 6 miles between them, and about the particular way that people's lives connect not through grand gestures, but through the small decision to keep showing up. Rose turned 19 in October. She had by this point been at Hales Cross for 7 months, and she was not the same girl who had climbed off the mail wagon with her jaw set against the world. She was still sharp, still direct, still had opinions she delivered without excessive concern for their reception. But there was a quality to her now that had been missing when she arrived, a sense of ground under her, of a place that was hers in a way she hadn't had to fight for, which had turned out to be for Rose the thing she needed most. Not to fight, to simply be where she was without defending it. She had started helping Clara seriously in the kitchen. This had evolved from the early careful neutrality through the gradual thaw and into something that looked, by October, like genuine collaborative interest. Rose had a particular talent for pastry that she hadn't known about before because she'd never had access to a proper kitchen and the time to use it. The discovery of this talent had the effect on Rose of sunlight on a plant that has been indoors too long, a rapid, almost startling growth toward it. "This is what I want to do," Rose said one afternoon, looking at a pie crust she had just completed with the expression of someone recognizing themselves in a mirror for the first time. "I mean, not just cooking. Something like this. Managing a household, running things." "You're good at it," Clara said, simply, without performance. "I know," Rose said, with the hale directness that still sometimes made Clara want to laugh. "I didn't know I was until I had the chance to find out." She looked at Clara sideways. "Thank you for that." It was the most direct thing Rose had said to her. Clara didn't make it into a moment. "You're welcome," she said, and handed her the rolling pin for the second crust. The thing with Dora Phelps happened in November, which was the last thing Clara had expected, and which arrived without warning on a gray Tuesday morning, still Tuesdays, consistently, life's least cooperative day, with a knock at the kitchen door. Clara opened it and found Dora Phelps standing on her step. Not with the committee, not with Florence Cade or the newspaper or any of the apparatus of opinion she usually deployed. Just herself, in a good coat, with the expression of a woman who has made a decision she finds uncomfortable and is committed to it anyway. "Mrs. Hale," Dora Phelps said. Clara looked at her, said nothing, and waited. "I would like to speak with you," Dora Phelps said. "If you're willing." Clara stepped back from the door. Dora Phelps came into the kitchen and stood in the middle of it for a moment, looking at the room with the particular attention of a woman who judges households and knows she does. Whatever she saw, her expression didn't give it away. Clara poured 2 cups of coffee and put them on the table and sat down. After a moment, Dora Phelps sat across from her. "My husband's youngest sister," Dora said, "has recently become widowed. Her husband left debts." She said this looking at the table, not at Clara. "She has 2 young children. She's in Laramie, and she doesn't know what to do." She was quiet for a moment. "I've been asking around about what might be done, what options a woman in that situation has. Your name keeps coming up." Clara looked at her steadily. "I don't know how to ask this properly," Dora said. "I'm aware that I've—" She stopped, started differently. "I said things. I allowed things to be said, which is the same, about your situation when you first came. I want you to know that I have thought about that." "Have you?" Clara said. Not a challenge, just an acknowledgement that she was listening. "I have." Dora Phelps looked up finally, with the expression of a woman who has practiced humility less than most of her other expressions, and is finding it difficult, but is going to do it anyway. "And I think I was more concerned with how things looked than with what they were, which is—" She pressed her mouth together. "Not something I'm proud of." The kitchen was very quiet. Clara thought about the step backward on Mabel Hargrove's porch, about the courier's community notes, about Elias asking, "Are we leaving?" with the flat resignation of a child who expected the answer yes. She thought about all of that and sat with it for a moment, which was something she had gotten better at, sitting with a difficult thing instead of resolving it before she was ready. "What does Calvin's sister need?" Clara said finally. Dora Phelps blinked, as if she'd expected something else to come first, and the directness of the practical question caught her sideways. She needs someone who can tell her what her options are, what a woman can actually do when she's in that kind of situation. I wasn't... She paused. "I didn't know, until recently, how few people there are who will tell her the truth about that rather than just sympathy." "Send her to me," Clara said. "When she's ready. She can come to the ranch, or I can come to Laramie if that's easier. I'll tell her what I know." Dora Phelps looked at her with an expression that was not simple. It was the expression of a woman processing the specific, complicated feeling of being extended more decency than she had reason to expect. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know," Clara said. "That's why it means something." Dora Phelps left 20 minutes later without having touched her coffee, which Clara suspected was because drinking it would have felt like too much comfort for a visit that she'd intended as penance. Clara stood at the kitchen door and watched her go and thought about what Sadie Greer had said, "People aren't one thing," and found that it was easier to believe now than it had been then. She told Gideon that evening in the plainly informative way they'd established for telling each other things. He listened and was quiet and said, "How do you feel about it?" "I don't entirely know," she said, which was true. "I think the honest version is that she hasn't changed and she hasn't suddenly become someone different. She's a person who runs up against a situation that matters to her personally and discovers that her principles have more flexibility than she thought." She considered. "I think that's most people, actually, including me." He looked at her. "Including you, how?" "I made judgments about Thomas for years based on who I decided he was," she said. "I stopped looking clearly because looking clearly was uncomfortable. That's not so different from Dora Phelps looking away from what a woman in my situation actually was, because the reality was more complicated than the story." She paused. "I'm not saying it's the same. It's not the same, but I understand the mechanism." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "You're more generous than I am," he said. "No," she said. "I'm just more tired of holding it." He looked at her and nodded and didn't say anything else, because some things were complete and didn't need adding to. Winter came again to Hales Cross, the second one Clara would see from this kitchen, which gave it a different weight than the first. She knew now what the cold did to the pipes, and which windows let the draft in, and how to bank the range to keep the warmth through the night. She knew which days Gideon came in from the barn with the tight-shouldered posture that meant something had gone wrong with the animals and needed talking through, and which days he came in with the almost expression that meant something had gone unexpectedly right, and he wasn't sure what to do with it. She knew that Colt's birthday was in December, and that he didn't mention it but appreciated a cake, and that Pete was afraid of the dark in a way he disguised as a general preference for lamplight and never directly admitted. She knew that Elias had sometime in the fall stopped watching the road. She noticed it the way you notice a sound that has been constant and then isn't, the absence of it more audible than the thing itself had been. He had arrived at Hales Cross watching every departure from the yard the way a child watches for signs of a larger departure. She hadn't realized how consistently he'd done it until the day she looked at him at the kitchen window and understood he was looking at the creek, interested in the ice formation at the edges, not watching for anything else, just looking at the thing in front of him because it was interesting. She had turned back to the stove and stood there for a moment with one hand on the range's warm iron surface and let herself feel it, the specific quality of relief that doesn't announce itself, that arrives quietly in the body like warmth does, reaching the cold places last. Elias came in for lunch and said, "The ice on the creek is doing something interesting," and started describing it with the focused enthusiasm of a boy who has decided that the world he is in is worth paying attention to. And Clara said, "Tell me." And he did. And the kitchen was warm. She thought about the woman who had driven into Blackbriar on a Tuesday in the fall, with $31 in a boot and nowhere to go and a sick child asleep against her arm. She thought about what that woman had believed possible. She thought about the boarding house door and the step backward, and all the moments in between that had seemed, each of them individually, too small to matter but had turned out to be everything. The things she had learned, not gracefully, not all at once, but by living through it, was that dignity was not given. It was not granted by a town's approval or confirmed by the absence of a newspaper item or established by a marriage certificate. It was a thing you maintained yourself, through the specific daily discipline of refusing to accept other people's definitions of what you were, even when those definitions had the full weight of community opinion behind them. Even when you were standing on a porch with your sick child and $31 and nowhere to go. She had learned that choosing was different from enduring. That a life built on choice, even an imperfect one, even one built with mismatched thread and bad first drafts and the ongoing necessary work of two people figuring out how to be honest with each other, was worth more than a life managed carefully to its smallest possible losses. She had learned that home was not a place you arrived at. It was a thing you built, repeatedly, out of the materials available, which were never quite enough and never quite what you'd have chosen, and which somehow, if you kept at it, became enough anyway. In the spring, Sadie Greer's husband was back on his feet, and their claim had a better season than the one before. And Sadie came to Clara with a jar of her own preserves, peach, which Clara had been working with her on for 3 months, that had set perfectly. She put it on the kitchen table and said, "There," with the satisfaction of someone who has mastered something that mattered to them. And Clara said, "There," back, and they had coffee. Howard Finch told Clara in March that Elias had, in his assessment, an unusual talent for mechanical reasoning and should be given access to more materials and problems to work with. He said it with the particular careful enthusiasm of a teacher who has identified something real and is trying not to oversell it. Clara listened and said she would find the materials, and did. Dora Phelps' sister-in-law came in April from Laramie, thin and frightened and carrying the specific shame of a woman who has been told by multiple people that her situation is her own fault. Clara sat with her in the kitchen for 3 hours and told her the truth about what was possible, what was not, and what the difference between those categories actually looked like in practice. The woman left with a list of names and a different quality in her face than she'd come in with. Clara did not know what became of her after that. She thought about her sometimes and hoped, and left it there. Rose, in the summer, told Gideon and Clara that she had been writing to a school in Cheyenne that offered training in household management and bookkeeping and had been accepted and wanted to go in the fall. She said it at dinner, directly, with her jaw set against the possibility of opposition, which was so characteristic of her that Elias looked up from his food with the expression of someone trying not to smile. Gideon looked at his niece for a long moment. "That's good," he said. Rose blinked. "You're not going to argue?" "Should I be? I thought he—" She stopped. "Most people would say it's not—" "Rose," Gideon said. "You're 19. You've run this household's account since March with fewer errors than I was making myself. You have a talent for organization, and you are completely insufferable when you don't have something to direct it toward." He drank his coffee. "Go to school." Rose looked at Clara. "He's right," Clara said. "Go." Rose looked at the table for a moment, with the particular expression of someone receiving more support than they'd braced against. Then she said, "I'll come back in the summers." "We'll be here," Clara said. It was that simple and that complete, the way real things often are once you've stopped fighting them. The kitchen door at Hales Cross was not a remarkable piece of woodwork. It had a latch that stuck in humid weather and a gap at the bottom that let in cold air in January, which Clara had stuffed with a length of old wool and then eventually had Colt properly seal in the second winter. It had been painted once, a long time ago, in a green that had weathered down to the suggestion of green. The hinges needed oil about every 8 months. It opened inward. It had always opened inward. Gideon had said the day she arrived that it opened both ways, which was a thing she had held on to and a thing she now understood more fully than she had then. It opened both ways not because the physics of it was unusual, but because the person running the household had decided that it did. That what was inside was not a fortress or a hiding place, but a home, which meant it was also a door you could leave through, and that the staying was a choice made every morning when you didn't. She had made it a choice. That was the whole of the thing, not fate, not rescue, not the intervention of fortune or the correction of injustice. A choice, repeated, in the ordinary light of ordinary mornings, by an ordinary woman who had been through enough to know the difference between surviving and living, and had decided finally, without apology or excessive ceremony, that she preferred the second. Elias grew. He was 9 and then 10, and the kittens became cats, and Penny remained his without question for as long as Penny cared to hold the appointment. Rose came back in the summers with more confidence and better pastry skills, and the specific authority of someone who has been somewhere and knows things. And Colt remained steady, and Pete remained impossible, and Gideon remained a man who said true things plainly and showed up for the work every morning, which turned out to be, over time, the most important quality a person could have. Clara stood in her kitchen on a December morning in her second full year at Hales Cross and looked at the frost on the window and the light coming across the ridge and the ranch lying quiet in the early cold. And she felt not happiness exactly, which was too simple a word for the thing, but something more durable, something that didn't depend on the absence of difficulty or the presence of perfection, something built out of difficulty, actually, out of the real material of things as they were. She turned to the range and got the fire going. There was work to do. There was always work to do, and she was exactly where she had chosen to be.